In our new Smart Women, Smart Power report, we analyze what difference it makes when we've had women in decision-making roles. Today, I am joined by amazing women leaders across different industries to discuss a theme that came up over and over again when we were doing the research for this report, which is the many ways that women have been in leadership positions throughout Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine since 2022, and in particular, how women have been leading the response. In short, we're going to uncover today the ways that women are contributing to the long-term fight. I'm Dr. Kathleen McInnes, and this is Smart Women, Smart Power.
This is Smart Women, Smart Power, a podcast that features conversations with some of the world's most powerful women.
I am absolutely honored to be joined today by this incredible panel of women to have what I think is one of the most critical discussions about national security today, how we can come up with different innovative approaches by having different innovative people, women, at the table. So we're joined today by Shelley O'Neill Stoneman, who is at Lockheed Martin, senior for government affairs. We are joined by Ambassador Kelley Currie, who was the ambassador at large for global women's affairs. We have Susan Markham, who authored Feminist Foreign Policy, like literally the OG on a lot of these topics. And of course, Dr. Kai Hunter at the Rand Corporation, who has been writing about and thinking about women, peace, and security, and the ways women are contributing to the fight for so long. First of all, just want to acknowledge, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your expertise. So thrilled to get into this conversation with you. So for those are in the audience and online, if you want to ask a question of this panel, please feel free to click on the link or on the QR code that's at the tables, and we'll make sure to bring those into the discussion as we go along. But let's get to it. Shelley, not long into the conflict, we learned that our stockpiles for basic military capabilities like ammunition were in short supply. How, in your view, has industry responded to the Ukraine crisis? And how have or have not you seen women shape thinking about rebuilding the arsenal of democracy?
Well, first of all, Kathleen, thank you so much for having us here today. It's wonderful to be with all of you and to have this great discussion with such esteemed colleagues. I think, many things happened at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict. That recognition that, in fact, we are in a very fragile moment, not just in history, but in fact also in terms of capacity and capabilities within the department in terms of munitions and other defense materiel. I will say, while I want to respond to your question on the industry side, I would be remiss if I didn't also first give a shout out to the many women in government who frankly partnered with industry in order to solution some of these issues. Everyone from the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, who you just interviewed, Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, Dr. Laura Cooper, a DASD for Russia and Ukraine, and then kind of the unsung hero, which actually ties directly back to how industry responded, Dr. Erin Simpson, who is the woman who responded to the 1,200 responses, requests for information of how can industry step forward and support Ukraine in this crisis. So these are the women who we got to work with, who helped to shape industry's response. Now at Lockheed Martin, very proud to say, and certainly many of our peers in industry, rose to meet that challenge and said, how can we help? Here are the different, kind of processes and systems and capabilities that we can push forward. But recognizing that we first had to confront this issue of fragility within the supply chain. At Lockheed Martin, we've pursued this concept called anti-fragility, which is really identifying, the weaknesses in the supply chain, finding second sources, kind of pushing expertise to help those suppliers so that they're not struggling out on their own, working with allies and partners, therefore aligning ourselves to the way the Department of Defense operates, and looking for opportunities for co-production, for regional sustainment in the areas of operation. So with respect to Ukraine, munitions being that key issue, made a determination, what investments can we make in order to, in some cases with our munitions, double and make significant increases in capacity for things like HIMARS, for GIMLRs, for Javelin, all these kind of programs that became top of mind for Ukrainians who were fighting on this. And so I do think, that the response that we saw in industry were a lot of different people rising to meet this challenge and working with our partners in government who kind of focused us on what is the best way to do so.
And so that partnership with government, having that leadership, having those articulations from these leading women was absolutely essential then.
Absolutely. I mean, again, I'll kind of, push Erin forward again. I mean, this is someone who 24 hours of the day, you could pick up the phone and call and get a response about, does this work? How can I, is this a solution you want to pursue? No. Okay, help me pivot to this one. What do you need from us? That exchange and just the fulsome effort, in this case, a one-woman paper hanger, but, it was really spread out across the department. And just being able to have that partnership and say, we know where we can move forward quickly and we know where areas where we're weak, but how can we kind of surge talent, resources, and focus in order to just, fix the problems?
Well, Ambassador Currie, in recent years, through some of the research we've done and some of the conversations we've had, you've been keeping close tabs on what women's groups have been doing around the world to stand up to authoritarian regimes. What are the threats you're seeing to women and women's groups? What threats are we seeing today? And how do you think the U.S. ought to be addressing those?
Well, again, as Shelley said, thank you so much. Such an honor to be here with you all and to see good colleagues and to be able to talk about topics that we all care so much about. Look, I think we are in a moment, and I think we're all seeing this, where you have this authoritarian resurgence around the world. I don't think this is a surprise or secret that authoritarian regimes are feeling their oats. They're feeling very empowered, and they're working together. They're networking in ways that we are not used to seeing, to have China, Russia, Iran, North Korea working together in the way that they are, not necessarily because they're end states aligned, but because their intermediate goal of displacing and causing problems for the United States aligns. And so that nexus of troublemakers or authoritarians or whatever you want to call them, I haven't really found a name yet that I like. There've been a lot thrown out there, but I'm still searching for the perfect.
It's true. It is really hard to sort of capture what they.
I don't really love crinks, although our friend Peter will kill me for saying that. But I do. I think that we do need to find a way to capture this disorder that they're thriving in and that they're creating. And I think that what we see is that often in this disorder, the consequences of using violence to solve political problems, of accelerating conflicts in ways that are unmoored from any political consequences on the ground. If you think about a situation like Burma or Sudan, where outside actors are contributing to very intense conflicts on the ground that are affecting communities, and the women's not just the women in these communities have often been at the forefront of efforts to promote democracy and human rights in these cases, and now they're in these really nasty, extremely violent contexts, and trying to find ways to drive the conflict away from civilian harm, engage with all of the power holders and weapons bearers to try to protect civilian populations in novel and innovative ways, and in many ways joining the fight head on. You have a lot more, I think, participation in both unarmed and armed spaces by women in these conflicts, especially I see this in Burma and in Ukraine. Where you see women just stepping into the breach and really finding themselves across the whole spectrum of armed conflict, civil disorder, and other destabilizing events and leadership roles across that whole spectrum of events. The reason that this is important, I think, to notice, and for the United States to really think about how we, incorporate this into our approach to peace building and peacemaking and conflict resolution and diplomacy and dispute resolution is that one of the things that we used to talk about a lot in the Security Council is the absurdity of trying to solve problems created by men with guns by turning to the same men with guns. And that this just, when you think about it on its face, it makes no sense. That we've got to find ways to get other people involved, and this was what the whole Women, Peace, and Security movement was about, but that we've really not done it effectively, I think, because we've in some senses really pigeonholed women into supporting roles in women, peace, and security. Now, I think we need to really think about how we frontline them in these contexts and really think about them as frontline actors more so. This is also a strategic advantage. This is something that we talk about a lot, that our adversaries don't see women. They not only do they not think of them as combatants, as parties to the conflict, or as a force multiplier in a conflict, they don't see them at all.
Right.
And so this is something where we have an advantage because we do see them. And our partners, our security partners, are interested in working with us on these agendas and on ways to think about whole of society approaches and more society-centric approaches to conflict resolution.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, it's in the last conversation with Dr. Hicks, there was a discussion of building strategic advantage and competitive advantage, right? We can talk to 50% of the population in ways that our authoritarian adversaries are completely ignoring. So why not work with women's groups? It's like a twofer. You get to support democracy and you get to mess with an authoritarian regime. This is
kind of my favorite part about it, actually.
But I was wondering if you could also speak to women's groups being targeted and women leaders being targeted, because I mean there is a recognition that there's something powerful.
Yeah, so when these regimes do see them, it is to target them and to really come at them. And I was having a conversation last week with women who are really feeling this stress of being targeted in online spaces.
Yes.
And how hard it is, and women who run for political office, and how difficult it is to enter the arena because of the specific kinds of targeting that they get. And in some ways it makes you think, why would any woman want to come in and put herself into this position to have people threaten you with sexual assault online, strangers make the most just horrific comments on your social media platforms. And in scale, thousands. Yeah, thousands of comments. Threaten your family, swat you, subject you to lawfare. I mean, all of these things that women are, I wouldn't say uniquely vulnerable to, because men have families also, but I think that as women, we do tend to feel more responsible for, caring for our families, and that, that we would expose them to harm in this way is very, I think it does have a specific and a very intentional effect on women. And I think that is a very intentional approach by authoritarian regimes. And how we navigate that while protecting freedom of expression and is a real challenge even in democratic societies, let alone in more authoritarian societies.
Is there any particular country right now that's sort of like, you're watching the discourse, you're watching these things play out, and you're like, we need to be, like, this is a canary in the coal mine, this is something we need to be paying more attention to? Is there any?
Well, I think you see it, especially with, again, I look at the scale. When you think about scale, China is our biggest adversary and they have the biggest presence. And the discourse around women inside the People's Republic of China, and the way that the state talks to and about women and about what their role is, it's become increasingly misogynistic, paternalistic, pushing women back into a childbearing role and family-centric discourse that is somewhat at odds with kind of the historic Chinese Communist Party women holding up half the sky discourse that I think most people think of when they think about the think about that scenario, but it's really become a much more, trad wife kind of Chinese CCP version of trad wives. And it's like, well, what is happening right now? And so when you see that happening in such an influential place that is also having a huge influence in the global South as well, in media in the global South, that discourse doesn't just stay in China.
Right.
I think that's what we find, when they are pushing out a discourse, it doesn't just stay there.
Well, turning to Dr. Hunter, you are one of the foremost experts on women, peace, and security. And so I wanted to get your insights on WPS and the conflict in Ukraine. What are you seeing Ukrainian women contribute to the fight, and also allies and partners in contributing to the fight in Ukraine?
Thank you so much, and I want to echo everyone's thanks for having us here. This is a just wonderful group to be a part of and such a timely, essential conversation. So when we think about women, peace, and security in Ukraine and how we see it play out, we can really look along each of the lines of effort, right? We think about participation. Women have stepped up in huge numbers to actually join the fight, and this was, I think what's really critical about this is despite what was attempted at the beginning often to be very gendered rhetoric, right? Men need to stay behind, we'll protect women to flee, and women really rejected that. And I think what it shows is the power of women of being half the population who have a stake in the physical safety and security of their country, not just a safety and security of the family, which is important, right? But there's this sense that no, this is our homeland as well, and it really elevated when we think about allies and partners, and we really think about the international discourse, and it plays a lot on the standing up to authoritarian regimes. I think it really highlighted three big things that forced international conversation. One is women's role as legitimate combatants, which seems like a weird thing to say here, right? But combatants as parties to the conflict. And this is, despite the fact that in a good part of the Western world, we've had women in the military for quite a while, there's always been this, they're talking about women relegated to support roles, but we see this even within the military side, right? That women aren't thought of as necessarily the real serious fighters, right? They're not there on the front line. It's okay if you're a postal worker or supply clerk or something else, but you're not real, right? And we talk about it a lot with the idea of invisible veterans that happen, right? That women aren't assumed to have had military service or the same way that men are. And I think what Ukrainian women have done is really force that conversation that they are not just part of the main effort, they are the main effort, largely because they've rejected the norms that were put on them for a variety of reasons. And that's forced both the normative conversation around this, but also a really practical conversation around what it means to have women in these frontline roles. And this is another role that I think industry is actually leaning into really well and has to be really engaged in, is the fact that women need different body armor. Women need different, our equipment needs to be built to fit a woman's body, whether that is a tank, an airplane, an M4, whatever it is, that women are there and visible and part of the main effort, and that's really essential. And I think it has forced that conversation internationally in ways that 50 years of women's participation in the military in the rest of the democracies never did. Even through Iraq, Afghanistan, with all these stories of women, you didn't see it force the national discourse the way that Ukrainian women are, and I think that's incredibly, incredibly powerful. The next piece, when we think about women, peace, and security, that the conflict in Ukraine is really raising up is, what do we mean when we talk about security? And really, where are the drivers of positive security? And I would argue that far too long, when we think about women's roles in broader sort of the global peace and security idea, women were always thought of as the peacemakers, right? Oh, they're going to prevent war. They're going to stop conflict.
Sprinkle the women.
Yeah, if we bring some women around, right, everything will just become calmer, more peaceful. Nobody would fight that way. But what we've seen is a real shift towards what are the drivers of positive security, not just peace, right? But it's hard to fight for these things, right? It is messy, it is violent, it is dangerous, right? All of those things that are there. But the things that women are bringing to the front lines isn't just I'm another trigger puller who sits here, but they bring the entirety of their lived experience, which has to do with taking care of families, with ensuring access to healthcare, with ensuring economic stability and housing stability and credit. And these things are being seen as just as part and parcel to the Ukrainian conflict now as land.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, to the comment around, we've turned to men with guns to solve the problems that men with guns created. Right now, when we have women with guns, they're bringing other solutions, right? They're bringing actual positive security solutions. And it's forcing a conversation in the international community in what does reconstruction look like, right? We can't rebuild Ukraine in the same way. And I think it's actually forcing a lot of conversations within NATO as to what does security look like? It's not just Russia encroaching on land, but it is understanding mis and disinformation that is incredibly gendered, right? Talk about like the CCP trad wives, right? If you just see the number of like, if anyone opens up their social media, right, you'll get all these pushes of like Eastern European trad wives who love their life, right? Which is so Russia pushing these things, right? And to foil that and contrast that to the women who are fighting in Ukraine is again forcing a real strong conversation about what is security. What do we need to do? When we think about that this isn't again just lands and borders that is there. And then third, with like where we see the Ukraine conversation going on, we really see what does it mean to be a leader and lead during wartime. And like, yes, Zelensky is not a woman, right? But he is embodying a lot of characteristics that are often typically considered more feminine characteristics, right? He hasn't resorted to incredibly bombastic rhetoric that we often see there, right? He has framed a lot of what he's been talking about protecting and taking care of, right? He's appealing to the values of democracy, to the values of protection, rather than we want to just go annihilate our enemies, right? Like he is, and it is
the dignity and value of human life.
And is focusing on building life and preserving democracy and preserving equality and preserving freedom that's there. And we don't often see that in wartime leaders, right? We often expect wartime leaders to be rolling around on tanks and like thinking about big military parades, right? Things like that.
Well, even Macron, like with that pose without his shirt on.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like,
Like you're not even in it. It was just a gratuitous little too much.
Never turn up an opportunity for a good half nude photo. Apparently,
I thought that was Putin's thing.
We don't still want to go.
Sorry, but it's very true, right? It's very true that and so it's forcing a difference in discourse as to what the actual desired security outcome is. And I really believe that is due to how women have participated and how women are viewed internally and the way in which they're taking on the responsibility not to walk around and sprinkle flowers and be like things are beautiful, right? But to defend and to demand that they are a part of the conversation, that they're not a secondary afterthought, they're not a civil society group you'll go pat on the head and say, look, we brought you to the table, aren't you glad that you're here, right? But to say we are the main effort, you actually need to change your systems and structures, sometimes literally, right? Like you need to change your weapon systems, sometimes more normatively, like you need to change what we think about security here. To fit us, we're not going to change to fit you.
Yes.
And that's a real critical piece of the conversation, because I think for way too long, women in the security sector were expected to either take on a supporting role or become a little man and act the same way all the men do to be taken seriously and to be taken effectively. And there's been a real sea change in that, where women are more and more allowed to be women in these spaces, while saying, yes, I am a fighter, a part of the main effort. I'm also a woman and have all of these issues and concerns and things that I am engaged with. And holding that duality and creating space for that duality is something that they are not going to back down from. The international community better get behind them, and we better not back down to it again, because it is the strongest bulwark against authoritarian rise to actually allow 50% of the population to be themselves, right? To not minimize the differences that exist, but to leverage them for better strategic advantage.
Well, you so many wonderful points that you made. One of the ones that sort of ties back to this report that we've just published today, what difference does it make? We analyzed 54 of the Smart Women, Smart Power podcasts and came up with a number of key insights and why it has been essential to have women in these decision-making spaces. And we want to thank BAE Systems and Thales and Lockheed Martin for their generous support that just enabled us to do this research. And one of the findings was that having women in these spaces helps mitigate organizational blind spots in critical ways. And so fast forward, we had this conversation with the CEO of Bobby, an infant formula firm, Laura Modi, who infant formula as a component of a national resilience plan is critical. Things like the Ukraine situation helps us understand you can, in a wartime context, you're going to have a hard time breastfeeding, right? So things like infant formula need to be calculated or part of our calculations on national resilience.
And I think to that too, if you pull back, I'm a big quant nerd, for those of you who don't, shocking, right, of all of this stuff, right? But I think if you actually you pull into how conflict starts, right? Why conflict starts, and you look at the issues around it, it's often things like food insecurity. It is housing insecurity. It is a resource sort of attempts for resource captures that are there. And so I'd say not only in a wartime situation are these things part of national resilience and ensuring that the conflict ends well, these things that so often get dismissed as women's issues are actually the things that can prevent conflict from ever starting if they are invested in from day one, right? If they are, right? If we think about going back to China being a canary in the coal mine, not only are they going back to this trad wife, right? They've got huge population imbalances with regards to single men, right? That there's a population imbalance which leads to instability. There's workforce issues and concerns and jobs, right? So these are all, again, drivers of potential conflict that are bubbling up at the same time that they're ignoring and pretending don't exist the very people that actually come with the solutions to fix it. So I think we see it as resilience, right? We need, whether it's infant formula, actually, menstrual products are a big one, right? Turns out people still get their periods when wars are going on, right? It exists, right? But but these are all, when they are addressed sort of in the pre-context, you can often prevent tragedy from beginning in the first place.
Well, Susan, if I can bring you into the conversation, we've talked about this any number of times. In national security circles, feminism is almost a dirty word. You don't want a feminist approach, what? But in reality, just to what Kai was saying, what we're talking about is seeing critical international security challenges through different lenses to try to get to better outcomes. Maybe we should stop doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So to what extent, you've written the book on feminist foreign policy, to what extent have you seen those principles apply in the way that we've been responding to the Ukraine crisis, how it's being prosecuted?
Well, a lot of them have been mentioned today. I should say thank you as well. I always joke that I'm like the USAID person, so I always forget the diplomatic stuff. I just jump right in. But, so in thinking about a lot of what's been talked about here, it actually reflects what we found when we were looking at the 12 or 15 countries that have announced that they have a feminist foreign policy since Sweden did about a decade ago. There are some common principles, and a lot of them have been reflected here today. The 4 principles are that gender equality is both a goal and a tactic. when you're doing foreign policy. And that was a great example here. When half of your population goes away to the front line, if you have not invested in gender equality, if women aren't prepared and educated and part of your system, you have a severe weakness. And so investing in gender equality over the long term prepares you to be more secure as a nation. Second of all, representation. Obviously, making sure that diverse voices are around the table. So women are not a singular group, so making sure you have women from different parts of the country, different religions, different education levels, speak different languages, from especially East and West in Ukraine. And so just making sure that you have those sorts of voices. Often in national security, that's the only thing people think of is, oh, we need women around the table. But really, it needs to be diverse women, and it's not just that. It's thinking about this diverse voices.
It's this, when we talk about women, it's just sort of, you've got to be at the table, that's cool, but it's an input.
Right.
What we're trying to accomplish is more effective outcomes.
Right, but it's easy to count.
Yeah, it is
and
true.
You get some good pictures, right, when you have women around the table. So they're like, check, we did that, you know. So that's often what people think of. There's also this expansion of the definition of security.
Yeah.
Right, it's not the traditional, but we're thinking, I mean, COVID taught us, right, health, supply chains, economic security. These are all things that feed into this idea that I feel safe, I feel like my kids can leave my house, I can do these things. So expanding the definition of security, and then finally this balance of power. So balance between nations and within nations as well. And so in the response to Ukraine, a lot of these things have been addressed. I think women have been stepping into roles both in government, in the military, and quite frankly, civilians across the country have stepped in and have filled vital roles. I was reading an article today about the local governments who are getting their own supplies for the people on the front line in their area. And so the local money that is staying in that area, they are using them very effectively. So civilians have stepped in for a year now, and so there's this balance between the central government and the local government. But they are thinking more broadly about building back differently and better.
Yeah.
So it's not going back to the way it used to be, but now that we have this opportunity, what infrastructure do we need? What kind of institutions do we need to create in order to move forward in that way? And then quite frankly, our partners, including NATO and NATO countries, I think are doing a pretty good job of standing next to Ukraine instead of coming in and saying, this is what we're gonna do now, where they're going to partner. And a lot of times, some of these governments have been much more heavy-handed with what the next steps are going to be. And this is very much about co-creating with Ukraine what they want the peace to look like and what will be like moving forward.
Well, we've got a question from the audience. As Ambassador Kelley indicated, one of the challenges with authoritarian targeting of women's groups is that it often wears the guise of like a traditional culture. We're going back, this golden age of what it used to be, and women are supposed to be in kitchens and having babies, and even if it's not actually a tradition, it's a way of masking its political nature. So the question from the audience is, how can the U.S. engage sensitively with diverse cultural legacies while at the same time countering authoritarian messaging? And I've opened that to the entire group, but start with you, Kelley.
Well, I mean, I think, it's the typical listen to the women, what we always say. Listen to them. They will tell you what they want, and they're given the opportunity, and giving them spaces and platforms in which to discuss what they think about their culture, how they vision their culture, what is important to them, and then listen to that. I think that's kind of step one. I think also what we've seen in some of the most gendered, most repressive spaces where I've worked is that, the women that work in these spaces are incredibly resilient, and they're incredibly creative about how they drive forward their agendas and how they are able to navigate with these norms and around these cultural norms. And I think that I have a great story, which I know I've shared with you about with Kathleen about the women in the Burmese democracy movement and how they've really been trying to subvert the these very misogynistic gender norms that the military government has used and really have created blind spots for them, and to subvert these as a way to undermine the confidence of the military. And I think you see this in Iran, you see this in other places. I think that the idea that it's okay to accept that, I think that we do have to be mindful of other cultures and sensitive to those things, but I don't believe that there is, I think that there is now a global recognition that women are human beings, that we get to have the same rights and as other human beings, and that this is like, you know, these are some of these things are fairly basic. When you get into the security space, you have to reframe these conversations, I think, a little differently. Sometimes it's even with our non-authoritarian friends that we have to have these conversations first, and I think that's part of the challenge too. For instance, when working with the Taiwanese, trying to get them to really open the aperture on getting women into their armed forces is a really important thing for us to do in order to combat the way that the Chinese party state is constructing their version of security. And that's like a really hard thing right now. Yeah. They've been really resistant to it. And it's less about culture than tradition, and it's like something that's been really hard to unpack. I know Indo-PACOM has struggled with it. I personally had to deal with it a lot and have really frustrating conversations with Taiwanese colleagues. But and this is a country that's had a woman president, has a woman vice president now, but still has very, very few women serving in their armed forces. And it's like, come on, guys. Like, you have recruitment and retention problems, you're having huge problems meeting your personnel demands, and you're ignoring half of the population that's interested and willing to serve. What are you doing? Yeah. Like, but these, so getting, I think it's always, put your own mask on first, right? Get our democratic allies to do the right things and set the standard. But then also listening to women in countries that are facing these hostile situations.
To piggyback on that just real quickly, sorry, I think one thing that I think is really important when we talk about culture or history and doing it that way is that I think we have to remember that a lot of history from which we assume culture has been written by men about men. And so listening to the woman piece, right? Who is absent from just our understanding of what culture is? If you pick up like almost any book that's like the history of blah, blah, blah culture, right? It's going to be written by a man, probably a Western man, about men in XYZ society that's there. And so I think it's really incumbent, and particularly for people who are in positions of power in democracies, to try to dig deeper to actually understand what culture and tradition is. Because I think we've gotten almost a very cartoonish understanding of a lot of cultures because of just what was simply chosen to be written about, rather than actually digging into the reality underneath. And so much is often missed because our only understanding is what was written by some Western white man about this, this other place. And so I think it's, really incumbent that there's a much more critical examination of what really culture actually means. Because if we dig into it and we start to appeal to what culture is, we see there is much more ground truth equity that is there in ways that have just been glossed over because it's inconvenient for the author to think about it.
Shelley?
I'm a big believer of if you can see it, you can be it. And so in these spaces where it is a more traditional approach, I think all the more reason why, kind of to build on Kelly's point earlier, you have to show up, as the U.S. government where representation matters. Yeah. And having the full population, America fully represented in terms of any of these, whether it's discussions, negotiations, emissaries, whether it's, kind of partnering in terms of military to military, you have to be able to show them what it looks like, and then also, frankly, approach it with humility. I mean, America is not covered in glory in terms of our entire history of providing equity and inclusion on both gendered side and frankly, in all kinds of other areas as well. But we have wonderful accomplishments to point to. I mean, right now, today we were talking about kind of commenting on how long it's been since, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, and then now kind of the work that's being done to kind of right some of the wrongs that were done then on military records. That's an area of humility. The Women's Combat Exclusion Rule, also only lifted within, the last kind of decade and change. And so being able to say, we've had to see it ourselves to believe it, but continuing to show up and pull people into those diverse spaces really does matter.
Susan, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say, and they're not surprising if you look at some indicators which are fairly internationally kept now. If you looked at rates of GBV or even the age of marriage, right? If the law goes down, the country is not moving in the right direction. If GBV rate, gender-based violence rates are going up, you're not going. If, why did the Taliban close schools for girls, right? They understood the power of half your population knowing how to read and moving forward and getting educated. And so if you look at some of these, you're like, that came out of nowhere. And you're like, not really, right? Like there are indicators that we are collecting, that the women and men in the country are aware of these issues. And so you can kind of see them coming. It's not a surprise if you're looking.
If you're looking. Well, on that note, another question from the audience. What can we be doing to support women in Afghanistan and Iran who are experiencing gender apartheid? Anyone want to take a bite of that one?
I can jump in some. I think what's really difficult, and I think just to name it, the difficulty out there is to support without coming in as the heavy-handed, right? Like, we're the United States, here's the way you actually have to do it, right? And so I think the number one place and space for this really is through education access. There have been long issues with getting visas for women to leave to go to school, right? And but I think if we think about supporting, right, what's really essential in supporting women and where we've seen this fail is often there's so much of a push and desire. It's like, well, we just need women there, right? We're going to push women into here, that we end up often pushing women who are not prepared to be in these positions, not because they don't have the capability to be prepared, but they just have not had the adequate preparations, right? They've been disadvantaged. They've had this lack of access. And so I think one of the best things we can do to support women is really push to improve access to education, which right now in these places means that there needs to be a real concerted effort to get women out of these countries to get educated so that they can develop the skills, develop the talents, also develop the international personal networks. I'm thinking back to bringing up Afghanistan, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, myself, tons of other veterans, who were there, right? We used our personal networks to get women out and mostly into schools in other countries, right? That a lot, we got a lot into the Netherlands, we got a lot into France, we got some into the US here as well, right? But these women are now getting set up to be able to go back armed with the skills and the networks to actually not just take on these leaderships, but take on and succeed, which is really essential. And so I think that's the biggest thing that we from over here can do to support is lower the barriers for access to education.
But then when they get an education, there've got to be places for them to go to.
Yes.
And in the particular case of Afghanistan, there's a huge disparity right now between how, the exclusion of women in international fora to this day, including by the United Nations, by our own government, and the way that we have not really created or sustained platforms for women who were able to escape, who still have connections inside. I work with a lot. We actually worked on helping to get women out because, again, one of the things that happened during the evacuation was, all the operators were getting their translators and interpreters out, and the people that they knew, and the ANA guys and the ANASOC guys, but it was, I am sure you had the same experience. The network of women trying to get women out was very thin and not quite as supported, and we didn't have the same community. And I was very fortunate that we were able to rely on male colleagues who were as dedicated to getting these female members of parliament and the female tactical platoon and the other groups that we were trying to get out of Afghanistan out. But it was really quite difficult. And now they find that we've been trying to get support for the women to have an office in Qatar so that they can participate in talks that are going on in Qatar, and they've been shut down by just about every donor on the planet. And it's stuff like that. It's like, we're not talking about a lot of money either. Yeah. We're talking about low dollar, high visibility things that can be done to platform women that do have a voice and want to be heard on these issues and do have the capability. We're talking about very senior former ministers, former judges, former parliamentarians who are very articulate and able to speak about what needs to be done, but who have been rendered almost invisible in the current discourse with the Taliban. And this is a huge problem. I think with Iran also, the women of that country have been very clear about what they want. And it's not a secret that they don't enjoy living under the Islamic Republic's theocratic rule. Every time they get an opportunity, they display resistance to that. And time and again, we let them down by not really standing up with them in ways that are, we do have to be mindful of coming in and big-footing things, but there are a lot of things that we could have done over the past decade in particular to support the women's movements in these countries and could continue to be doing to be more supportive of these women's movements in these countries when they're fighting for their own rights.
And I would say just one last thing, and when we have panels in DC and New York and other world capitals, they should be on the main stage. It's not the WPS breakout session, right? It's a key issue.
Exactly right.
These women have been on the front lines. They've been lifting up, they've been organizing, and then you come over here and it's just like, so men, what do you think? They know what they want.
And not just on a WPS stage, but they should be on I have seen numerous Iran and Afghanistan manels in the past 3 years that I'm just like, really? Seriously? What that mean? Think tanks in this town. What is going on?
And when you bring them, it's not to be on the main stage, not to be the tokenizing or patronizing, right? When you put them on the main stage and it's the tell me about breastfeeding in a conflict zone, right? No, that's not. So I think it's the getting them on the stage and actually asking them the hard security questions.
Well, and one just sort of imagines, what could we accomplish? What could we do if women's issues, women's perspectives were not just the sort of nice to have thing on the side, we're actually central, core to how we think about national security? What kinds of possibilities could we unlock with that simple shift? It's not resource intensive. It's just, it's a really
Most of this is about political will. It's really what it comes down to 90% of the time. It's about political will.
And with that too, I think there's this misconception that women's issues aren't serious. And so you see political leaders continuing to, I'm going to use the term pander, because I think it's the right term, right, to the sort of classic male idea to not be seen as too radical, to not be seen as too different, right? Whereas if we look at actual just demographics, populations, right, women actually make up more than half of the electorate in just about every democracy that's out there, right? Women do. And if we spoke more directly to women and framed their issues against not as the nice to have, here's a little side thing, but as the core central tenets to what it means to be a secure nation, I think we could, but it has never, it goes back to tradition, not culture, not facts, not actual demographics, but tradition of this is the way that politics works. These are the people we need to appeal to. This is the groups that we need. We need to make sure that we're not going to lose this traditional focus. Whereas I think if someone just did it Like it.
Yeah, I mean, if the tool you're most comfortable using is a hammer, every problem is a nail, right? So let's just go back to it instead of thinking like, maybe there are other issues and we need to build out our toolbox a little bit.
We might need pliers or But one of the themes across this conversation has been anti-fragility, resilience. So I'd be interested with all of our panelists, your thoughts on what does that actually mean in practice? I mean, and particularly Shelley with the defense industrial view, because it's so important for how we think about these large systems and how we mobilize. And how are you thinking about resilience?
Resiliency, I'll tie those two together because I do think that the lack of resilience is present when you have fragility, certainly. I think, we've talked a lot about the human factor of resilience, and that's incredibly important, but maybe pulling back for a second and just kind of looking at the defense industrial base and what has been encountered since COVID, Ukraine, kind of the wash of crises that have befallen us. Anti-fragility, what that looks like in terms of not just the industrial base, but the government partnership is really based on 4 things. So for my industry colleagues here, I think there'll be a lot of heads nodding. Consistent funding that is predictable, that allows you to kind of have a real plan and understand what the demands are for years at a time. A supply chain that is diversified and managed and tended to and given time and attention, not in the moment of a crisis, but kind of spread across years to bolster this consistent plan that you're building, essentially. You're also trying to, our view is that you need to reduce the compliance necessary so that small and medium businesses can enter the market and aren't deterred from continuing to thrive in it, many of which, by the way, are run by women. And then finally, back to kind of the stability piece, it's, multi-years, long lead purchases, funding, learning from the lessons that we've taken away from Ukraine and understanding that, in many ways we were in a peacetime stance for far too long. And we assumed that industry could surge to meet whatever demand anytime, just turn the key and the cold engine will start. And so it's those 4 elements that really make up kind of what an anti-fragility ecosystem with government and with industry would look like. But without any one of those elements, you're starting to erode resiliency and you're having a likelihood of that weak link in the chain. So I think in my view, that's one of the big takeaways that both industry, government, whether kind of those on the outside looking in, understanding that when we encounter another conflict, how do we ensure that we are not going through the same thing all over again?
Is the construct of, what is it, coopetition, right? Like
competimates,
competimates, right?
Competimates.
Do you see that having more traction now in recent years? And would you just this notion that we don't all have to be at the apex of the chain, that actually having resilient infrastructure, supply chain, so on and so forth, means we have to have different suppliers, different vendors for critical capabilities, that there's plenty of work to do. And we can all do it together.
There can be multiple winners in a anti-fragile system, quite frankly. I mean, one of the goodness elements that came out of this kind of lessons learned is really this focus on co-production. You talk to some leaders of the Pentagon, they call it co-everything. Everything is working with allies and partners to kind of and including competimates to pool resources and to become strong where you're weak. We just, did a partnership with, for example, General Dynamics, addressing one of the issues that's kind of the long pole in the tent on munitions side, which is solid rocket motors, right? This has been just the issue for years. There are only a couple of providers. So we decided, hey, let's work together. How do we solve this problem? That may not be the answer, but it is an answer. And so that's kind of folks just different coming together, stepping forward, but then trying to do that with even allies and partners and their defense industries so that we're bringing that stability regionally, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in, kind of Poland and Germany. Those are all areas that, frankly, Lockheed has partnerships, but others are doing it for the exact same reasons, because you want to ensure that we're not just kind of going right back and have to learn these lessons again the hard way.
Well, I do have to say, in foreign assistance, I think we would like the same 4 things, right?
Yeah. Yes, that's
we are
right.
lacking those consistent funding over a long amount of time, diversified supply chain, reduced supply. I mean, these are issues that we struggle with all the time. You cannot change social norms in a 1 to 3 year program, right? It's very hard to build a whole clean water system in a whole country in 1 to 3 years, and not being able to think, it takes away some of the ability to think more broadly if you know you have these challenges. So for good or for bad, we have the same challenges.
I think we also, the operating system problem there is too. I was reading something the other day about how there's like 170 something different operating systems on the continent, just with our European allies alone. And I mean, this is not sustainable, right?
Yeah.
We cannot think about the future of our security with that kind of particularity around. There's no resilience in that. That's That is a source of potential fragility that I think we need to really think about. And I would say the same thing across the foreign assistance space, where everybody's got to have their own little, boutique project but I think we're also in an era though where we can't rely on UN agencies to be effective. We've seen really huge problems and drop-offs in terms of effectiveness and capabilities and hollowing out of competencies within UN agencies to where the cost benefits analysis for the United States and some of the other large donors is getting to be like, what are we really getting from working through a UN agency other than paying an enormous overhead? Like, what are we actually getting for that? So I think we're in a really a period of alignment where a lot of opportunity exists for creative thinking about how we solve these problems, but it does require us to think, I think, how we work with our partners and allies with some of these things. What are our real priorities? Are we thinking structurally and systemically? I mean, it's great to build a water system, but if the country falls into civil war the following year, that water system's gone, and all your work and effort is worth nothing, and it's a waste of effort and waste of money. And so I think really thinking there's been this long conversation about governance and about thinking politically around development, but we're still so far away from it. And I think that one of the things when it coming back to women, peace, and security is women, peace, and security is thinking politically about women, peace, and security also, and how that this is ultimately, a lot of this is about power. It's about political will. It's about will to power. These things are serious impediments to the improvements that we want to see, and we've got to grapple with those things. We can't kind of dance around them. We've got to be hard-headed and face these things head on.
Yeah, and I think it's you were talking about sort of compliance and barriers to entry is where, when we talk about fragility, I think that we have in almost every system, right? Whether it's the defense industrial base, whether it's foreign assistance, whether it's education systems, we've put ridiculous barriers to entry for what it means to be successful, to achieve anything, which then makes it impossible to unlock the funding, right? Because you can't, right? Or you consolidate and conglomerate into one big thing that becomes ineffective because
and a gatekeeper.
And a gatekeeper, right? We add gatekeepers to being able to get anywhere, but it also, and so I think we see it on the macro scale, but it also really exists on the micro scale when we think about like fragility and what it means and what it matters. To like even go back to the Afghanistan case, right? There are several other women that I worked with to get out here who I had worked with in my military life were physicians, right? And they have no ability to get a job anywhere. It doesn't matter that they were, they had 30 years practicing as a physician, and now they're like, well, you can just go back to medical school, right? And like, which is like, because we're like, we don't recognize your
and it's not like we have a huge surplus of doctors willing to serve in rural areas as OBGYNs and things like that.
Which is where most of these women are, right? Like, so we can solve, but we create gatekeepers, and we see it on this micro level, which then increases fragility, right? Because now you have more vulnerable populations, and these are people like with skills. And so I think these macro problems and these 4 macro areas translate down to the micro fragility issues where we see people who are, a bad day away from breaking into civil war, and we've done it to ourselves. Like, we arbitrarily just decided that, like, this is a gatekeeper standard that's not really based on anything other than we decided this, right? Like, I mean, it's not, there isn't like a real rationale behind it.
Sometimes.
And it just perpetuates fragile systems.
Oh, another question that's come in from the audience, sort of shifting gears a little bit. DEI has been smeared in the news in recent months, but I would say for many years, actually. Can the narrative behind diversity, equity, and inclusion be fixed?
Yes, okay, I will take this. Since I get smeared for it all the time too, right? Yeah. And conflated with what things are. So I think it can, but it goes back to where political will exists and what we prioritize as key security issues. You know, the term has gotten used and smeared around the idea because it's equated with lower standards, right?
Yeah.
If you are diverse, it means you are less. You didn't achieve. You didn't do anything, you know, that way. And I'm going to use like an anecdote to tell, I think, how we can change it, right? So I was, a few years ago, I was talking with one of my male colleagues, and he was like, you know, he was an active duty officer still at the time, and he's like, you know, I've noticed something that like whenever I end up, you know, hiring a woman, she's like better, who's like from the pool, right? She's better than any of the men that like I bring in to work with. I was like, well, yes, because like in the military context that we were in at the time, I was like, well, because we have to be 20% better at everything we do to be seen as the same, to be seen as equal that is there. So like objectively, yes, we are just.
Yes.
Turn out just to be all that, right? Because like we have to achieve it the standard, right? So I think there's a few things that we need to leverage to really change the narrative. One is to be much more transparent about what standards are and why they exist, right? What do you actually need to get to these jobs? You know, I think another very clear anecdote that tells this story really well was around when the removal of women in ground combat exclusion happened, which actually forced, I mean, I'm a Marine, so I can speak to the Marine Corps side, right? Like, forced the Marine Corps to set standards for people to get into infantry officer school. Prior to that, your only standard was like, you're a male who passed basic, right? And so now we had to, and they couldn't, and they had to be standards based on what it is that you actually had to do, right? And so it turned out, once they created the standards, that actually a lot of men couldn't meet them, right? Like a lot of men actually couldn't do the things, right? And a lot of women couldn't either, but a lot of women could, and a lot of men still could, right? And you actually saw that the ratios were about the same of like just people who could do it, right? So I think the first thing around it is being really transparent about what standards are and why. And I think DEI has gotten a bad name because in virtually every industry, standards and promotions are so opaque. So opaque that
And pay scales.
And pay scales are opaque. And so bringing these things into the light makes people uncomfortable, right? Because the status quo thrives in opaqueness. The status quo thrives in this darkness that's there. And so to really change this narrative, it's about being transparent about what standards are, being transparent about what professional expectations are to exist in a place and just why they are there, not because I said so, but here they are. But also about addressing and being real honest about what harms have existed and what they have historically done to marginalize people. You know, and having those conversations objectively, rationally, around the fact that there are systemic injustices that have kept certain classes, whether it is based on gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, identity, right, that have excluded them from the ability to even access these things, and remedying that needs to be done, again, transparently and openly, and talking about why it happened, not just saying, oh, well, we fixed it because we put a policy in place, right? But having an actual narrative that is attached to it that shows where the harm was done is, I think, critical to change this conversation about diversity.
Well, also, to the point, like, when we talk about DEI, I think what we're really getting at is having like organizational cultures that are actually respectful of humans,
Yes.
right? That's it.
That-
So it doesn't
yes,
really matter.
that treat us as individuals.
It's treat us as
Well, yeah,
individuals.
and
like,
talking about outputs, not inputs. Like,
Right,
we
like, and
stop
so-
the DEI conversation at inputs all the time.
That's
Yeah.
where I was going to go with
Exactly.
it. It's
Yeah.
being respectful and valuing the whole purpose, but I'll talk about it from the business perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a concept that frankly, far before it kind of hit the headlines, is something that our company valued because I mean, there's all kinds of data, and I suspect your report will validate this, that diverse organizations, leadership teams, boards produce better outcomes.
Yeah.
And so everything we have done historically in our company in that realm is tied to a business purpose, and that we are recruiting the best talent in the world.
Yeah.
We are ensuring that we're retaining the best talent in the world, that we're building an environment where the individual human is valued, but they're also part of a diverse team. And I mean, the feeling that you get when you're in that kind of, diverse organization, and I felt it myself, just showing up at leadership events, and it's like, wow, these are, times are very different from when I started in this world, 25 years ago. So I think that there's something to it that as long as you can tie it to your point, the outputs, the outcomes, the business, just proficiency is really critical. And so that the rest of it became noise, but there's a way to reclaim the narrative and make it meaningful to whatever your intent, your intended purpose is.
But it does have to be rooted in performance, and
Yes.
especially when if we're circling back to national security, it's got to be rooted in performance, and it's got to, when the rubber meets the road, you've got to be able to meet the standards, and we can't, and I think your point, Kai, is dead on, but you also raised one of my favorite, that women, the Ginger Rogers syndrome, we have to do everything backwards and in high heels. And this is, so we do have to be better. But that means that we're bringing something there. I think also making our colleagues who want to be allies understand how kind of crappy it is to walk into a room and be the only woman there, be the only person of color there, and how dislocating that can be as a human being, and still that this still happens to me at this point in my life just makes me insane. And so I think that it's really, talking to our colleagues about this too, so that they understand that it's not, it's not about a grievance or about lowering standards, and that it's about fairness, it's about opportunity, and about getting the best people for the job, and then being able to make the machine perform at the highest level.
Well, when things get better for women, it gets better for all. Things get better for dudes too. It's like,
But it means too, I think, to the point of attracting and retaining the best people, means that the system might have to change to accommodate them.
Yes.
Right. That there's, and I think it's changing the narrative that it's, to your point, right, we're tying this to business outcomes, but that means we might have to change the way we do things to bring in the best talent, because the status quo or the current system brought in a certain type of talent, brought in a certain type of person, brought in, maintain that person. We might have to change to maintain that best talent.
We
right?
have to change
yes.
because the times, what it took, right? If you have the standard that you have to be able to carry a certain amount of pack, okay, a lot of warfare is not have anything to do with that.
We haven't gotten to this about what is the new way of warfare, what we're seeing in Ukraine. It is completely different. It is not, we're going to build a legacy system that's got to last for 50 years. It's like, we've got to build a new system from scratch tomorrow. It's like the whole thing is changing.
Right.
All
the standard needs to change, and because the qualifications need to change, you need to think broader.
because the strategic environment is changing, because the character of warfare is changing, all the things,
So why keep building on that same framework?
Just adding stuff to the pack.
It's in the way of
Got to keep adding stuff to the pack.
Well, so another question from the audience. How is the potential for a woman commander-in-chief changing the conversation on women, peace, and security? And what will that mean if it happens?
I mean, that potential's been there for...
It's inevitable.
And it is
There have been
inevitable.
women heads of state in lots of places.
Yeah, and the world has not come to an end. Last time I checked, we're all still here.
Right. Kumbaya has not broken out of the UN Security Council.
Nobody's making doilies.
I agree. It's inevitable. It's going to have to happen at some time. I think there's discomfort because it's different, and people, anytime something is different, people are like, well, don't know what might happen. But I think it goes back to, again, when we look at, like, really what are the standards and qualifications for being commander-in-chief, right? So if we hold up, like, if we create our list, because there really isn't standards and qualifications other than you were born in the United States and you're over 35 years of age and you got elected, right? I mean, that's the only thing that actually exists, right? But if we were to create, like, our dream list, right? If we were to all sit around and say, here's what we actually think a commander-in-chief could do, which I think actually this room would, like, create some pretty good.
Let's do that.
Let's do it, right? But I would guarantee you that a whole hell of a lot of the men who have held that job do not meet those standards that are there. So again, I think it goes back to peeling back the onion of why this is such a thing, right? Because people are afraid of change, right? So it's a knit, right? This is why DEI gets a bad name too. Oh, it might be different, might be afraid, things aren't gonna, like, work out the right way, right? So I think it has to go back to thinking about, well, when we say, what does it mean to have a woman commander-in-chief, what question are we actually asking? Yeah. Right? Or is the actual question the fact of, like, I don't know if a woman could declare war? Well, like, we've actually seen really hawkish women that have been out there. If we just look at, like, Congress and, like, the Senate, right? There are women who very much voted to go invade countries that we have, right? So, like, that shouldn't be, right? So there's that piece, right? Are we saying question on her, like, she wasn't eligible for the selective service, so, like, she wouldn't know what it means to be in the military. We've had plenty of male presidents with zero military experience. Nobody was like, well, we're not quite sure if, like, a man could be there, right? So it's I think really, I mean, what it means is that we'll wake up the next day and a female body will happen to occupy that seat. Like, but I think what it opens the door for is actually a broader interrogation of, like, what does it mean when we're asking this question, and really, what are we afraid of? Yeah. Right? What is it? Because we have, right, there have been plenty of female heads of state in other countries, and, like, what we both our allies and adversaries have had women in positions of power, and Kumbaya hasn't broken out, and the world hasn't completely ended either. And so I think it offers us an opportunity to really reflect back on, like, what are we worried about? What is that thing that we are so afraid to let go and actually look at the qualifications of the person rather than gender?
Well, this is Smart Women, Smart Power, so I'm going to ask each of you a question that you guys are actually familiar with. Do you think that your gender as a woman has had an impact on your leadership, decision-making styles, the decisions you've taken? If so, why? And if not, why not?
I think it's truly about your lived experience, and being a woman is part of that. I mean, for me, my identity, I'm an only daughter of a single mom, married to, was an Army wife at one time, mom of two. I mean, all those things, and of course my socioeconomic background and how being the only in the room for many years working on national security and the various treatments along the way, those all have influences. And then having to be, 20% better, at certain things and go backwards in heels, that drives you in different ways. I do think how you approach it's really what kind of a problem solver you are, what kind of a leader you are, and what experiences you had along the way that provide that guidance, some right, some wrong. But I think that I consistently believe that when you have a more diverse group at the table, you will have better solutions. And frankly, the more diverse those lived experiences are, the better the solutions are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I 100% agree with Shelley. Obviously, I think it's, yes and no. I think that, like I was saying before, we all bring all of our stuff, and the only story you really ever know is your own. And so I try to treat people as individuals and approach them from that perspective. And I feel like I'm very fortunate that I've had the experiences that I've had and that I've been able to do the things that I've been able to do. I also know that I made choices along the way with having kids and, deciding that I needed to take time off because I had small children and needed to take a step back from doing certain things. And those were choices that I made, and I'm good with those choices, but they are not necessarily the same choices that other people would make. And I'm okay with all of that. But yeah, I think it does make you a better leader, that you do have a lot more empathy for people who are struggling with these kinds of choices. And I think we all do at some point in our lives and our careers struggle with difficult choices. And so I do say that I think that being that being a woman boss and having that lived experience, but not all women have that lived experience. So I'm not even sure that that's really a woman thing as so much as a me thing. I don't know.
I really want you to ask Ben this question.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
How has gender impacted the way you have led? And has it changed? Because it's not just about being a woman, but men oftentimes are trapped in the masculine box and not able to do what they would have wanted to do.
And rarely very self-aware about it, I would say.
Well, and I think to that point, I think that's really important, because I would say, yes, it has, but only because it became on reflection, right, as I've gotten older. Early in my career, when I was a Marine and I was the only woman in my squadron doing what's considered, I flew attack helicopters, which is considered like a very masculine thing to do, right, all the time, right? I, on reflection, realized that I adopted a lot of very masculine traits in order, like almost as a survival mechanism, right? As a way to I just don't, but I think people do that, right? Anyone who's been an only, right? You sort of adopt these, especially when you're young, these ideas of like, I just need to put my head down and like make it through another day. So whatever I can do to make it easier on myself, I will, which meant for me, and I'm going to assume for many other women in this room as well, like meant acting very masculine to survive. And it wasn't, and I think one of the things that I actually see as very encouraging, we talk about smart women, smart power, is it took me a few decades, but then I was like, wait a minute, I don't have to act like a little man, right? I don't have to act like one, I don't have to dress like one, I don't have to think like one, I don't have to right? Like all, right, but I think that back to if you can see it, you can be it. I think what gives me hope is that in the younger generation of women, they're sort of line jumping and refusing to get pigeonholed into this masculine box, to be in national security, to be in leadership, to do things that way. And it gives me hope for men too in this regard, right? That men aren't pigeonholed into, I need to be a certain way to be successful, right? That you can be more yourself, because it is when you can show up as yourself. You fill gaps, right? If you can bring the entirety of your lived experience to the table, you actually fill in gaps for each other. Because I know, like, if we were to like assess the security issues just in this building here, right? We'd all see something different. We would all be something else that would be like, X might be a threat, right, that we have there. But it's all based on what's happened to us, right? And if it's assumed that we have to conform to the same way of thinking, we're gonna miss like where the big problems actually exist.
Well, we are at time, so I want to thank this incredible panel for such a rich discussion. I want to thank all the people who submitted questions. To the questions that you provided were just really great fodder for this conversation. Again, I want to thank Lockheed Martin, Thales, and BAE Systems for their contribution to make this report possible and to help us carry forward this analytic agenda. So thank you so much. 10 years of Smart Women, Smart Power, 10 more to go at least. Thank you so much for being here today. And if you could join me in a round of applause for our incredible panelists.